Okay. Okay. All right, we are streaming live, and this is a discussion about this new book, somewhat new, Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism by Gabriel Rockhill. So this is a very interesting book, and I think I would compare it to another book that I have read in the past, and I think a lot of people have kind of referenced or talked about, which is the Francis Stoner Saunders book. Here it is, very large. Who Paid the Piper? The CIA and the Cultural Cold War. So I consider Rockhill's book almost a sequel to that other book. Um, so this is, I think, a more approachable text than the Saunders text. I really had trouble reading this one and the other book. Whose author I can't quite recall, the other Cultural Cold War book. This one, the Saunders book, talks more about the Encounter magazine and stuff like that. And that's been the focus of a lot of these books in the past, like these very literary focused investigations looking at how the CIA co-opted and funded these groups that were already spewing out this sort of stuff, this sort of leftism, and the CIA, sometimes, arguably with the lack of knowledge of these authors, these left-wing authors, and a lot of Trotskyists and things like this argue that they didn't have any knowledge that the CIA was funding them. And this goes, these older books go into that sort of thing. But I think this Rockhill book could be a lot more useful, a lot more approachable for new readers, except I do have to point out, before we get into the text itself, which you can see, we're going to start out with the right hand side of the screen. It's going to talk a little bit about Orwell. It's going to talk a little bit about, the CIA's money and the American money, which is really the root of this whole situation. And I think people misunderstand that when we're talking about publishing, we're talking about, the funding behind the publishing. And we're talking about the distribution network that spreads out these publications to enormous lengths, world-spanning publications, right? When we're talking about Orwell in a minute, his books were turned by the CIA into the most published works in history besides the Bible, at least in terms of the number of languages during the early 50s. So Orwell became this big figure, and other figures we're going to talk about, specifically in terms of the Frankfurt School and philosophy. These figures became so widespread because of the CIA money, right? And this connection between the CIA and the bourgeois media industry, the bourgeois publishing industry, right? These capitalists who own the publishing empires, who control the newspapers and the televisions, and even the academic sphere, right? The universities. The money is at the root. The universities themselves are relying on this money, on these grants, from essentially capitalist donors. And the CIA is there in between, helping the capitalists give money to the right people. So we're going to dive in relatively quick, but I wanted to talk about the title of the book, right? Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism? Is again a reference, kind of a more approachable continuation of this book by Francis Stoner Saunders. And what I think people miss out with this phrase, and I think a lot of the supporters of the Frankfurt School miss out on, is why we are talking about this. And of course they argue that this sort of history, when we're talking about the history of the CIA itself, the history of the U.S. empire in promoting the Frankfurt School, funding its publication, funding its distribution, making it so popular today that we have to talk about it, they misunderstand that its history is connected to its theoretical essence. They really miss that out. So when we say who paid the piper, we're really pointing out that whoever pays the piper calls the tune, right? The funders and promoters of this stuff, they get something out of it. And they regulate the kind of Marxism that is promoted, the kind of leftism. And I think that's perfectly suited for where we're going to go with this conversation with Orwell in a minute. So we're going to focus now on the actual book itself. And so this is interesting. In the center of the screen, you can see this fun political poster from, I think, the year 1950, political satire cartoon from an East German communist magazine. So when we start out, we're just going to do a little bit of a reading session. And we're talking about John Foster Dulles and the creation of this imperialist empire in Western Europe. I'm just going to skip to the interesting part. Right, the material system of ideological production thereby succeeds in turning the world upside down, a model of imperial disinformation. But before we get into this text, before we get into the book itself, I have to point out that Rockhill is not a Marxist. All right, he is not a he is a rightist, I would say, a rightist deviationist, right? A right-wing revisionist of Marxism, promoting things like market socialism, right? So really, he's not the solution to these problems that we're going to be reading about, but he's on the other side of things, and he's talking about a history that is real and that we do need to talk about. But when he talks about things like the dialectical perspective, a Marxist analysis of this and this, that's not what he's doing, all right? And in fact, I'm going to skip when he talks about that, because it's not serious, and I don't think he's really equipped to use this language appropriately, Marxist analysis and dialectical this and that, right? It's more like buzzwords, and it's kind of in-group signaling to the sort of tanky people who, of course, I like to call myself a tanky jokingly as well, but these sort of people who mostly support like modern China as a form of socialism. And so that's who Rockhill really is aiming this book towards. Pardon me. All right, now we're going to get into the book itself. So this is a subject I'm more equipped to talk about or more knowledgeable about than the later chapter we're going to talk about, chapter 5. So this is chapter 3, I believe. And I studied Orwell for quite a long time to try to figure out what's going on there in terms of what kind of leftist or whatever he is. And what I found, which I think is very mainstream today, right, the whole Orwell's list kind of stuff, was that he is an intelligence agent. He was an asset of intelligence for years of being an actual intelligence agent, going back to his career in Burma with the army, where he did intelligence work with the Karen people of Burma against the Burmese nationalist Buddhist-affiliated movement there in Burma, the kind of anti-colonial nationalist movement in Burma back in the early 1900s. And so he moves to France and continues that sort of work. So, and after that, we get into this very interesting part of Orwell's career, the Information Research Department. So this is what people will really be familiar about with the whole Orwell's list narrative. It'll touch on this. So the IRD in the British Foreign Office was a powerful propaganda agency that served as one of the models for the US-led empire of ideas. Now, and this is very true, that the IRD was really attached with that publication, mass distribution project of the CIA to take Orwell's work and the work of other people that we're going to mention and distribute them to Indonesian speakers, Malay speakers, Chinese, Hindu, all these different languages where hundreds of millions of people are speaking, and so this is their access to leftism, for example, right, publishing Animal Farm. The IRD was established by the Labour government in 1948. Clement Attlee kind of stuff going on, famous for chopping people's heads off in Malaysia. It grew out of the disinformation agencies founded during the Second World War. All right, and that's very true as well, Rockhill, that the IRD was mainly focused on disinformation, and one of the famous things that they did was use kind of lurid, inappropriate kind of activities, right, accusations of inappropriate activity against nationalists in Cyprus, for example. They made these, invented these stories and then shared them to their friends in the newspapers and the media to talk about. So SO1, the propaganda arm of the Special Operations Executive, and that's basically like the murder machine of British intelligence, that had been set up in 1940, became a separate entity known as the Political Warfare Executive. By 1941, according to Paul Lashmer and James Oliver, the PWE was housing some 458 propagandists, mainly from the universities and the press corps. And there we go. So this is already at the center of what we're engaging with, that this is a professional body, a professional armed body of certain people within existing institutions, right? And so we say, oh, how can you say that this news agency is compromised or that university's work can't really be trusted? Well, there are people within these agencies or within these institutions and running at the top of these institutions, making these decisions that are what we would call compromised, right? They're the leaders of these universities, and particularly these employees, right, from the universities and the press corps. These employees are in direct contact with intelligence. Pardon me for my microphone. Direct contact with intelligence, right? Taking orders from intelligence. So that's what we talk about when we mean these institutions are not trustworthy. It exercised full political control over the BBC's foreign broadcasts, and during the war, this nominally independent news agency became an instrument of state information policy, guided by the MOI, Ministry of Information, and the PWE in all of its activities. It's very interesting that actually Orwell's Ministry of Information in his 1984 book is actually based on his real experiences working with the strict, censorship and control while he was working at the BBC's foreign broadcast service, where he did foreign broadcasts for India, while it was a British colony, of course. The MOI and the PWE, which also worked extensively with other media outlets, were closed down after the war. All right, the rebirth of the latter, which focused on covert rather than overt propaganda, like the MOI, emerged out of Christopher Mayhew's proposal to develop an anti-communist propaganda agency in the Foreign Office that would target the general public, but also distribute its materials to ministers, Labour Party officials, union delegates, and other community leaders. Mindful of the risks of straightforward anti-communism in a strong pro-socialist sentiment context due to the Soviet defeat of Nazism and the electoral success of the Labour Party, Mayhew cleverly proposed a third force propaganda campaign that would attack capitalism as well as communism and promote social democratic values associated with the Labor Department. And this is very important for us as communists to really be aware about. That, sorry, I might be interrupted in a minute. But here we see a Ministry of Information officer, a guy planning this tactic of appropriating the label of socialism on behalf of capitalism, critiquing capitalism on behalf of capitalism. That's really the core of what we see here, right? So people will say, "Oh no, they don't work for the CIA. They're critiquing capitalism. They're practicing critical theory. They couldn't possibly be working for the government." Well, in actuality, we see that the government is talking openly about the need to appropriate the socialist and communist victories and the successes of our movement in the 20th century. So the IRD emerged out of Mayhew's proposal and was financed through the budget of the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, known as MI6. The IRD made use of the intelligence coming into MI6, worked closely with the anti-Soviet Section 9 of the Secret Service, and later collaborated with the CIA. The IRD was extremely well funded, established permanent channels for the routine transmission of its now considerable output of anti-communist propaganda all over the world. As Lashmar and Oliver explain, while to the man in the street, it appeared that a diverse range of media were separately coming to similar conclusions about communism and the nature of the Cold War. In fact, much of the media was singing from a hymn sheet provided by IRD, right? So this is a common joke today that all media repeats the same phrases as if from some shared script that's distributed to all the different local media affiliates of most of the attention is on Fox, but on the right wing, they point out that the same thing is done on NBC and CNN and things like this. So this is a particularly potent psychological weapon strategy. Warfare strategy, because if sources from different perspectives, which might have significant disagreements, all concur on certain fundamentals, it sends the message that these agreements are based on fact, not ideological persuasion, when in reality, the opposite is the case. So if you have two people who hate each other, each saying the same thing about a third subject, then you're more likely to trust, right? Oh, there's a consensus on this issue. MI6 and the CIA both use journalism as a form of deep cover for their officers. This is very famous. And then here we start getting into the Orwell list stuff, I think. No, sorry, that's happening later. Many of these reporters passed off Foreign Office research as if it was their own, thereby laundering state propaganda as independent journalism. And I think that's very interesting as well for thinking about Herbert Marcuse, who was the state's expert on communism. And Herbert Marcuse wrote this lengthy treatise on Soviet communism and its failings. But I think here we can see that there's a bit of a shady line between the state's voice and the voice of writers like Marcuse, that the state can make Marcuse put things in his work that are going to be published as if he thought them originally, and kind of mandate that, no, you have to include this part in your work. You have to include these so-called facts, right? And it's perhaps this sort of attitude, right, this fake consensus, this manufactured consensus, this insertion of certain talking points, that this might be a big reason why we see people like Solzhenitsyn in major academic settings, right? His work, Gulag Archipelago, is so widespread among less scrupulous history departments in smaller universities and American history classes the world over, or American sponsored, I should say. But it's possible that this book, Gulag Archipelago, is fairly dubious. So it's really curious why lots of history departments would keep using it. Well, maybe it's an order from on high. Maybe it's above their pay grade that certain, and this can be established and reified over many, many years, many decades now, that this is a good work to cite, that you have to cite this, and in fact you can't speak against it. So going back to Britain, MI6 has penetrated the English mass media on such a wide scale, according to Ken Philby. The BBC was completely controlled at multiple levels, and MI5, the UK's domestic security service, vetted its staff for subversives from the 1930s until the practice was revealed in 1985. Again, another question for why was Orwell allowed to be an employee of the BBC, and even in the BBC's foreign service, if he was a so-called radical leftist subversive. The IRD also established, penetrated, subsidized, collaborated with, and took control of numerous news agencies in order to demonstrate or disseminate its propaganda around the world. And we have some examples of that, which you can check out the book for. It was to the IRD that George Orwell submitted his infamous list of suspected communists in 1949. The author of 1984, An Animal Farm, is widely celebrated as a critic, but he was basically honeypotted by Celia Kerwin, who was an IRD officer, kind of the part of the tradition of censorettes in the British intelligence services during the war, that you had these women, lots of women were involved in intelligence work, not just secretarial work, but really important administrative work, and there were also once they were believed to be trustworthy, they were used for intelligence purposes, perhaps like trying to control Orwell. For example, he was very pathetic in his later years, Orwell, on his dying bed, desperately begging women to marry him on his deathbed and things like this. Really, he was in a weak state, and so very easy to get him to manipulated. And so it seems like that's what Celia Kerwin, and we have in the Orwell archives in England some messages from Celia Kerwin to her bosses in the IRD about this process of trying to get Orwell to be more helpful to them. Orwell was repaid for his dutiful service as an anti-communist snitch, also as a decades-long intelligence agent for the British Empire in Burma, France, the Spanish Revolution, etc. By creating this film, Animal Farm, as I mentioned earlier, Animal Farm became one of the most widely published books in the entire world, next to the Bible. It also bought, translated, and distributed their work around the world in order to guarantee their fame. In addition to Orwell, these authors include Bertrand Russell, Arthur Koestler. I think Arthur Koestler is a very adequate comparison to Orwell, right? Very fitting comparison, where Koestler was a fake communist, a guy pretending to be a leftist because he was an intelligence agent, and then goes, communism's evil. I've realized, because I'm such a leftist, that communism's evil, when in fact he was a associate with the British intelligence, the whole time. Many of the leading bourgeois historians of communism were products of the IRD. Robert Conquest, I believe it became a huge scandal later on, perhaps is a little too famous to cover for too long, that Robert Conquest and other authors took fake stuff that the IRD had sent him, right, fabricated disinformation material, and put in his books on the Soviet Union. So very, very funny stuff. And a lot of the time, stuff like this that Conquest put in, or that Solzhenitsyn put in, they're never corrected. So this stays on the record, this stays cited by historians, and so it just gets passed on, and we today are handed it, and people will tell you, how can you say that it's wrong? It's in all these history books, when we know exactly why it's in and how it got into these history books. Maurice Cranston contributed books to the IRD's Background Books series, and this LSE, which is the London School of Economics, formed a Center for Anti-Communist Academics. Conquest, of course, had a research fellow there in the 50s. And it goes on like this. By promoting and supporting specific intellectuals, politicians, and trade unionists, the IRD helped shape and define the political consensus of a generation. And so now we go on to the next section, the Marshall Plan for the Mind. The Cold War was and is a war fought with ideas instead of bombs. And I think that's a very important point for understanding the strategic aspects of the Cold War, that the U.S. really wanted to nuke China and the Soviets. They really, really wanted to do it. And the reason they did it is because they did not do it, famously. They did not nuke Moscow or Beijing because they knew it would fail. They believed it would fail because the military capacity of the Soviets, and of course the Chinese to a lesser extent, would not have been totally destroyed by bombing Moscow, by nuking Moscow, because the Soviet tank armies and aircraft and infantry and the political rallying that would happen around the communists if the Americans did this would lead to the complete defeat of Europe, in terms of a military battlefield, right? That the Soviet tanks, NATO identified this long ago, that back in the early 50s, that if there was a direct kind of peer-to-peer competition between the Soviet and socialist armies and the Western NATO armies in Europe, that the Soviets would win because of their, surpassing, really, enormous advantage in heavy artillery and armored vehicles. So really they understood, at least by the late 50s, it became completely clear to the, strategic planners in NATO and the CIA and stuff, that really they needed a war of words kind of strategy, because the war of bullets really didn't work out. Of course, they could do the war of bullets in Indonesia, right? They can kill 1 million communists there. They can do the war of bullets in Vietnam and Malaysia. At least they can try, and we can see that even that can fail. But in Europe, the war of bullets would be contested directly by the Soviets. So it was very important to, and I think that's really the big takeaway for what happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? This ideological victory of NATO. And, that's how we view things like the Afghanistan war today, through that lens. So, talking about Nabokov, in 1951, Nabokov became the General Secretary of the Congress of Cultural Freedom, which is at the center of the international ideological war on communism. That I did not know. Isn't he the Lolita guy? I think it's very appropriate that, you've got the Lolita guy with the CCF, working for the Epstein ruling class, doing, and then you got Foucault and his buddies with their petition along the same lines of Lolita type stuff later on. For instance, the Psychological Strategy Board, PSB, formed in 1951 to provide for the more effective planning, coordination, and conduct of PSYOPs, ran an anti-communist doctrinal program that aimed to develop a more extensive and intensive use of serious books and of highly intellectual periodical materials. Sorry for that noise. As well as the fostering of associations and meetings among intellectuals. And here we see a very important point again, that this is not grassroots PSYOPs. This is not exactly just mass media stuff. Especially in this early period, what is happening, and I think very relevantly for the Frankfurt School side of things, that this is happening at the top. This is happening, between intellectuals, between the bourgeois class, trying to rally the supporters of the bourgeois class, the petty bourgeoisie and the intellectuals, to an important point, an important platform that the bourgeoisie really needs them to be united around. So by focusing on the intellectuals, right, instead of the lower classes, they can really accomplish a consensus on what to talk about. Wary that any intellectual effort which might be identified as selling the U.S., or as a strictly American propaganda effort, would be doomed to stagnation and defeat, the program sought to manipulate nationalist feelings to the advantage of American objectives and the weakening of communist influences. And this is very much connected to something that I don't think is touched on, but Gladio stuff. So you've got a few years after this, touching on nationalist sentiment, things like the Hungarian quote-unquote revolution, right, the Hungarian uprising in 1956, right, which was using these nationalist, formerly fascist forces in Hungary to carry out this, armed by the CIA and MI6, to carry out this counter-revolutionary action, to try to push the boundaries, right, because they knew they had to carry out this warfare covertly and not overtly because of the Soviet advantage. They, this is kind of testing the boundaries and forcing the Soviets to overplay their hand a little bit, right? It forces us to use an armed response, which we always are reticent to do. But they create a situation in which an armed response is the only appropriate response. And we see that later on with, in a different strategic manner, with the Years of Lead and the armed groups, especially right-wing and fake leftist armed groups that the CIA and their allies were funding in Europe later on in the 60s and 70s. The Marshall Plan particularly played an important role in integrating Western Europe. So, of course, this is very economic, right? Marshall Plan is involved in money going into the European cultural economy as well. On June 18th, 1948, the NSC approved NSC 10-2 to clandestinely funnel Marshall Plan funds into sub-rosa political activities in Europe, including psychological and political warfare operations. From its creation in 48 until 52, when the Marshall Plan was terminated, the OPC operated as the plan's complement. Its actions were meant to be and remain covert, so they could be plausibly denied by the government. And here we touch on kind of interconnection with Gladio, right, where Gladio had to be completely deniable, completely covert. And here we see that the more intellectual, cultural side of that, which did support Gladio, and they do get into that in this book by Rockhill. Let's see. See if there's anything interesting. So here we are talking about the ECA, the Economic Cooperation Administration, thus collaborated with the propaganda arm to secretly use Marshall Plan funds to influence Europe without their actions being attributed to the U.S. There's a political focus on particular focus on political, economic, and psychological warfare. We know from the files that they had around 70 employees working in this psychological warfare, including many Americans. So this propaganda arm was the economic administration's close collaborator on the Marshall Plan for the mind. Originally functioned semi-autonomously to maintain plausible deniability, although it was given quarters and rations by the CIA and received guidance from the Departments of State and Defense. However, it was gradually integrated into the CIA beginning in 1950. So here you can see, it's getting very difficult to coordinate all these things, and of course Gladio has to stay off the books, but this more political warfare, cultural warfare kind of stuff can be more acceptable, or more directly associated with the CIA. Although it's of course, everything the CIA does is relatively secret. And here we have Tom Braden, who had served in the OSS during the war, taught English at Dartmouth College, worked as executive secretary at the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, pursued his career in the CIA. Braden was what some scholars call a professional psi warrior, meaning an official dedicated to psychological war for hearts and minds, which was generally judged to be very important, more important than military warfare. In his covert operations, he strived to bring together intellectuals, artists, writers, and other cultural producers in a common front against communism. What you must write, and what you must say, and what you must do, and what you must paint, against all rigid barriers in the Soviet Union. And so here we have, getting into the support for kind of abstract art and things like this that are against the stream and the main line of the Soviets, right, which is on socialist realism and representational art. They're kind of anything goes when it comes to undermining the Soviets. The centerpiece for the IOD's and CIA's Cultural Cold War was the Congress of Cultural Freedom, run undercover by CIA operative Michael Josselson from its Paris headquarters. The CCF evolved into one of the most important artistic patrons in world history, sponsoring an unprecedented range of cultural activities. According to CCF documentation, the organization's budget reached $2 million in 1966, which is about $20 million in today's money. Francis Stoner Saunders, whose book we mentioned at the beginning of this stream, estimated the CIA's involvement in the CCF at tens of millions of dollars. And of course, we know that the CIA has access to more funds than Congress gives them, which would be their legal limitation, and they act beyond that. One of the rules which Tom Braden, this former OSS, now museum guy, one of his rules was use legitimate existing organizations, disguise the extent of American interest, protect the integrity of the organization by not requiring it to support every aspect of official American policy. And we touched on that earlier before, that it's much more effective to have propaganda that, for example, criticizes capitalism or criticizes American policy, and then when they go on to criticize the Soviets, the readers and audiences see it as more legitimate. Support for left-wing forces that were non-communist was a key tactic. All right, here we're getting into the Frankfurt School stuff. Braden's Frank Insider account, I'm glad the CIA is immoral, 1967, great name, by the way, is what is called in company parlance a limited hangout, which is a propaganda tactic that consists in providing restricted insider information to stem the tide of future investigations and control the narrative. So we're just going to keep going on, talking about Hannah Arendt. A lot of really famous people were getting support by the CCF. And I think we've laid out the basic architecture of the funding process. So I'm going to move on to Chapter 5. So if you look in the book club chat, I've sent a link to that Chapter 5 that you can read right now while I finish up this other chapter. The authors implicated in the book and magazine programs that the CIA covertly funded are too numerous to summarize. Arendt, Arthur Koestler, Orwell, Theodore Adorno, Albert Camus, who was supposed to meet with Orwell at one point in Paris after the war. The CCF, given its means and connections, was able to offer incredibly lucrative deals and opportunities for intellectual fame. I wonder if that has anything to do with how popular their work became. To take one revealing example, in 1961 it invited anthropologist Clifford Geertz to present a series of lectures at the University of Khartoum in Sudan, where it also planned to invite half a dozen equally eminent scholars from around the world. The lectures would be collected and published. all of the expenses would be covered by the CCF, which of course is the CIA. And all royalties arriving from it would go, they would get special privileges to the enormous amounts of funds that you would have access to by having your books be, spread across the world and translated into all these languages. Suddenly your books are being purchased by millions more people than they would formerly when they were just published in English and French and German. This seems fairly interesting, that this person Bell was an esteemed Harvard professor renowned for his theses on the end of ideology and post-industrialism. Very fitting even today. 70 years later? These exact same theses, right? Almost Fukuyama-esque. We heard today, thanks in part to funding from the world's most notorious spy agency, 10 books that Aaron contributed to were published, including his manuscript, 3 essays on the industrial age, Japanese translation of his anti-communist classic. CCF covered travel expenses, to really get this stuff out there. Bell's most famous book, The End of Ideology, asserted that the grand humanistic ideologies of yesteryear, Marxism, were exhausted and revolutionary movements would no longer be able to attract the working class. Very interesting that he's talking about this in the 50s, I think, maybe the 60s for this later book. He also expressed his gratitude to major CIA cultural warriors like Aaron, Irving, Crystal, and Sol Levitas. Without ever mentioning the company, he referred to CIA agent Melvin Lasky as an old comrade, stated that he owed much to agency operator Michael Josselson for his practical political wisdom. Very interesting. So I'm going to go to the Frankfurt School stuff because I think we get the picture, right? That money is back in this whole thing. Here we have the imperial theory industry. This is chapter 3. Last one, I believe, was chapter 2. Sorry, we're going to go back to chapter 3. So we have Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Very interesting that Horkheimer is also implicated in this CIA cultural apparatus. In the case of both, it is surely their bourgeois background and petty bourgeois class position that drove them to denigrate the entertainment industry to which the masses. Blah, blah, blah. So I wanted to point out again, I know I mentioned at the top of the stream, that Rockhill is a rightist deviationist, right? He's a right-wing revisionist of Marxism. He's going to give a kind of parody version of Marxism a few times in this book. He's going to butcher the concept of dialectics in Marxism because he's a rightist. So let's just overlook, when he attempts to do that and focus on the more interesting stuff, right? When we read a bourgeois history of CIA's involvement in the culture industry, we don't get bogged down in the fact that they're a bourgeois historian, exactly, right? We care about the facts. And here's an interesting fact. It's worth recalling that Adorno's father was a wealthy wine merchant, and Horkheimer's father was a millionaire. Didn't know that either. But we do know that, anyway. The class position of these intellectuals and their specific standing within the international relations of intellectual production go a long way to explaining their blind spots, as well as their ideological alignment. And here I don't want to drag too on with Rockhill's analysis in that regard, so we're going to skip down to chapter 5. Frankfurt School critical theory has, along with French theory, been one of the hottest commodities of the imperial theory industry. And that's very true. I mean, we see that it's very popular today. Horkheimer participated in its junkets of the CCF. Adorno published in the CIA-funded journal Der Monat. And again, a lot of Trotskyists and opportunists who defend these guys, they say, they didn't know, they had no way of knowing. But you can definitely, if you apply Marxism, and if you had the capacity to apply Marxism, you could see that the class siding that they're taking is pretty clear. What is the character of what they're doing? But of course, people like Deleuze would say that ideas have no ideological essence. that ideology is an outdated notion. So, of course, if you believe that, then there's nothing wrong with any of these ideas. Death of the author, becomes very helpful to absorbing revisionist concepts coming from literally the CIA, or at least promoted by the CIA. So here we hear Melvin Lasky's name again. Employee of the U.S. military government in West Germany. Lasky was the founder and chief editor of Der Monat, and a member of the original steering committee for the CCF. We're going to skip down to Chapter 5, the Washington School of Critical Theory. And I think this will hopefully get into some of the stuff we're more interested while we still have time. We're not going to be on for too much longer. The Frankfurt School's integration into the U.S. military-industrial academic complex. The majority, now I think this part is actually, this history is very important for us to know as communists, but of course the supporters of Foucault and these guys, they don't care. They're going to reject any of this information, no matter how shocking, any of this is. The majority of the core members of the Frankfurt School after the war were not working as professors or full-time researchers for the Institute for Social Research, which is the basis for the Frankfurt School name. Instead, they were in the employ of the U.S. government, serving various state agencies for years on end, including the OSS, which is the predecessor to the CIA, of course, the State Department and propaganda agencies like the OWI and VOA, which are latter of which is very important today, very famous. They were thus intellectuals and purported Marxists, who labored in the service of the capitalist state that would emerge from the war as the leading imperialist power. And of course they say, we're just working with the OSS to fight the Nazis. You can't criticize for us for that at all. But isn't it a remarkable fact, Rockhill writes, though one unworthy of critical scrutiny, that is arguably the most famous school of Western Marxism, was largely integrated into the intelligence and propaganda agencies of the U.S. government. So yeah, I think this is a really important thing to know, that these guys were publishing as part of a network of intelligence controlled by the U.S. And it seems shocking to deny that has any significance for what they published, even though we know from the previous chapter that we read, Chapter 2, that the U.S. government is inserting talking points directly into their work and not, giving them credit for this idea, but really it was written, back in the CIA's offices and handed to them to put in their work. So, that we know that sort of thing is going on. As we see, 7 affiliates of the Frankfurt School worked for the world's leading imperialist government for a combined total of over 50 years. They formed a veritable Washington School, almost like a School of the Americas, but for intellectual pursuits. The Frankfurt scholars in question worked for state agencies, military, benefited individually via the Institute from foundation grants, and pursued research at major institutions. Rather than separating their governmental work from their later academic scholarship, they all need to be seen as part of an organic totality within which these scholars operated. And of course, many of them defended their work within the government explicitly. And I think we'll see a quote from that. Here is Marcuse. I am convinced that this time, meaning working for the OWI and OSS, that was Horkheimer, will not be lost with regard to our common philosophical work, both under practical and theoretical aspects. So here we see Horkheimer, who was one of the big ones alongside Adorno, advocating for working for U.S. intelligence openly. And this itself is the behavior of an intelligence agent. And I'm just going to pull up an interesting image on the left side of your screen that maybe you'll be. Oh no! See, let's see if I can pull it up. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not Horkheimer. Am I misremembering? Yeah, I thought these basically fascist guys who we all love to make fun of over at Infrared, I thought they liked Horkheimer and Adorno, but maybe it's Heidegger. I think they did talk about Horkheimer with Carlos. Did they delete that, or am I crazy? All right, let's just move on. And so here we see these Rockhills kind of flirting with Marxism. This is an interesting point again. The OSS, where many Frankfurt scholars found employment, served as a model for the CIA. Basic history. It was founded in 1942 along with the OWI, the Psychological Warfare Agency, that also hired many of the Institute's researchers. Like Marcuse, for example, I believe worked for the OWI and wrote that report, that study on the Soviet Union for them, for the consumption of course, U.S. Political leadership and things like that. These two organizations, the OWI and the OSS, I believe, resulted from a split in the Office of the Coordinator of Information, COI, the intelligence propaganda agency established in 1941. Right, this is for World War II purposes, right? So they take this apparatus, which is created very quickly for World War II, and they turn it into something that's very relevant and applicable for the new Cold War that they actually knew from the beginning that they would be getting into. And in fact, we see some of the planning against enemies in World War II, like against Japan and Germany. They kind of augment some of that planning to make it also applicable to a war against the Soviet Union, for example. They promoted really a long-range bomber kind of strategy with that in mind, that it would be more relevant for use against the Soviet Union because everyone knew basically after a certain period who they would be fighting. So you got Wild Bill Donovan, a very famous CIA guy, and Hoover's enthusiasm for covert operations and military intelligence created conflicts with the liberal heads of the COI's propaganda service. And we know that after World War II, there was a purge by the conservative elements of the bourgeoisie, purging the Rooseveltite liberal wing of intelligence. So they got rid of all these bleeding heart liberals, legal bourgeois legalists, got them out of there, and then we were able to really focus on the more immoral, as the previous guy called it, and covert work that the CIA is more known for. So here we talk about the COI's Research and Analysis Branch, RNA, was integrated into the OSS. It's conceived of as the heart of the intelligence organization, right? So it's all about information gathering at first. The OSS's other principal branches, secret operations and special operations, were to function as veins and arteries feeding into and supplied by the RNA, respectively. In 1941, we see that the OSS, focused on German enemies, had taken the initiative of requesting from the exiled scholars of the International Institute for Social Research at Columbia a list of experts on Germany to be found within the refugee community. Franz Neumann, who offered to share the Institute's research materials with Donovan, recommended Horkheimer, Adorno, Pollock, Marcuse, Otto Kirchheimer, Leo Lowenthal, and Arkady Gerlant. Horkheimer supported himself with funds from the Institute, which was sustained by Wall Street investments and donations from its wealthy patron, Felix Weil. Adorno had been employed in a joint appointment let's start that sentence over again. Adorno, rather than Horkheimer, had been employed in a joint appointment at the Institute and the Rockefeller-funded Princeton Radio Research Project. Neither of them required additional employment. However, due to Horkheimer's budgetary cuts, the others were in need of work. In the months following Neumann's recommendations to Dorn, the Frankfurt scholars bombarded the OSS with applications, manuscripts, and research proposals. Right? So the signal has been sent out. Look, if you want this money, if you want this support, all you have to do is ask the CIA for it. And they've been given the signal that the CIA will be receptive to this request. So they send a bunch of requests. Marcuse, for instance, sent to the chief of psychology division manuscripts he had written on the new German mentality and private morale in Germany. They actively wanted to collaborate with the U.S. government, and in their entreaties, eventually bore fruit. As early as 42, 5 affiliates of the Frankfurt School had begun to supplement their incomes with part-time consulting jobs for various of the new war agencies. Marcuse and Lowenthal with the German section of the OWI, Neumann, Gerlin, and Pollock with the Board of Economic Warfare. And I think that's something we still see today, right, where you supplement these puppets, basically, these puppet speakers, in modern academic and pundit context, by giving them outrageous speaking fees, right? You're flooding their income to keep them relevant, to keep them, engaged in this intellectual industry by giving them excessive amounts of money, right? And so they really prosper from that. That they can go to and pay for their travel expenses. They can spend more time writing because they have sufficient income. Marcuse, Neumann, and Kirchheimer then began working regularly for the OWI. Before accepting the job, Marcuse told Horkheimer that his function would be to make suggestions on how to present the enemy to the American people in the press, movies, propaganda. The Institute's director encouraged Marcuse to take the position, saying that they would continue to collaborate and that Marcuse would use his government position to advance Institute projects. Again, explicitly linking this supposedly independent, right, NGO organization, the Institute for Social Research, the Frankfurt School, with the actual government itself. Marcuse is entering a government office, getting a government job, and using that as part of his ideological work with the Frankfurt School. He explained to Horkheimer that he would serve, Marcuse, would serve as the Frankfurt School's semi-official liaison in the U.S. government, making invaluable connections and developing this state intellectual nexus so as to assist the Institute. The nature of my work there would be such that this collaboration would be very close, very logical, and even to some extent official. I feel strongly that I would be of much compensating service to the Institute in many respects. I would be a kind of liaison man between various offices, particularly between the Office of War Information and the Office of Strategic Services. The prefigurement of the CIA. One small indication of how direct collaboration between the Frankfurt School and the U.S. bore fruit is that one of the Institute's manuscripts that Marcuse shared with the OSS, the Elimination of German Chauvinism, received feedback from the state agency in 1942. Horkheimer found it most interesting and referred to the OSS input as the first really valuable and substantial advice we received in this matter. So here we see directly that they are getting instructions, getting advice, as it's called, on what to change their work to make it more acceptable to their people they're selling it to. And that's a great way for the CIA and the state agencies to impart changes and make Marcuse and Horkheimer make those changes themselves rather than some editor coming in after it's already been written and making the changes that the CIA wants. No, the CIA is in kind of a collaborative attitude. That's how bad this situation is with Marcuse and Horkheimer, that they're in this constant collaboration back and forth, getting feedback from the U.S. government on how to make their work even more compatible. Horkheimer indicated his support for the further work on the project along the lines suggested by their predecessor organization to the CIA. The point person in the U.S. for their exchange, Edward Yarnell Hartshorn Jr., great name, later became the primary education officer in charge of reopening of German universities in the U.S. occupation zone. So here we see control of the academic institutions. While Bill Donovan soon recruited Marcuse, Neumann, Kirchheimer into the RNA of the COI-OSS. Pollock was hired by the Antitrust Division, right, pseudo-leftism, liberal reformism, as an advisor for the War Production Board. Lowenthal found a job at the OWI alongside the famous anthropologist Ruth Benedict, and then at VOA, the very much more famous and much more sinister CIA mouthpiece. Those working in RNA all moved to the State Department when it was relocated there. That makes 5 Frankfurt School intellectuals in government service out of the 8 whom Thomas Wheatland identifies as part of Horkheimer's primary circle. As for the other 3, Erich Fromm was in New York with Horkheimer and Adorno, before the latter 2 settled into well-to-do areas of Los Angeles, and on and on. Lowenthal was as a consultant of the OWI, and Pollock as consultant at the DOJ's Antitrust Division, The only ones who were spared were Horkheimer and Adorno, the two principal theoreticians. Marcuse was as a senior analyst at the OSS, like Neumann. And I mean, that's basically the pretty interesting stuff. Let's see if there's any. I don't know if you guys who have joined want to speak, or if you can even request that. Lots of OSS historians. I think there's also someone that's not within the purview of this book, but I believe Paul Sweezy, who is one of the founders of Monthly Review, is another one of these guys. So Monthly Review is basically a CIA cutout that's doing this thing where they act like perfect communists when really they're kind of Trotskyists and, of course, employees of the OSS and giving information to their masters in Washington. This state-backed approach to history was by no means exceptional. The OSS director, William Langer's History of U.S. Policy during World War II, was closely coordinated by the State Department and funded by a substantial 4-year grant to the Council on Foreign Relations that had secured from the Rockefeller Foundation. The model for this project was a collective war history in Britain overseen by the acclaimed academic Arnold Toynbee, who was employed by the Intelligence Department of the Foreign Office and was later financed by Rockefeller to work on this history in coordination with the Foreign Office. And so here we see a very important element, the Rockefeller Foundation, and that's really prominent in this history of the CIA funding of cultural matters. In the field of English literature and American studies, Norman Holmes Pearson worked for the OSS and became head of the X2 branch, the Counterintelligence Service in London during the war. After the armistice, he returned to Yale, where he founded the American Studies program, which promoted U.S.-American interests during the Cold War. American Studies programs are very interesting case studies for modern, American chauvinist cultural, supremacy, right? They promote the idea that America is anti-racist and, using oppressed nationalities within the U.S. to be the voice of the U.S. and say, oh, we're not oppressed anymore, here we are leading the country, when in fact the people really leading the country are the bourgeoisie, who don't really have a race, but in the U.S. are, overwhelmingly white or whatever. Not that is the most important part of their identity, of course, being capitalists. So it doesn't matter whether you're a black capitalist or a white capitalist, really you share core reactionary beliefs. Let's see, is there anything else interesting to touch on before we go? OSS, oh so socialist, in the service of capital. It was as if the left Hegelian Weltgeist, world spirit, had taken up temporary residence in the Central European section of the OSS, colleague of the Frankfurt scholars said. Oh so socialist was one of the nicknames given to the OSS because of the number of leftist intellectuals like Marcuse in its ranks. Although there were many liberals, Donovan thought it was important to put socialists to work as well, as long as their research bore fruit. He even personally hired a young economist suspected of being a communist by the FBI, Paul Sweezy. Tim Mueller explained, the objective was to have multiple perspectives, including from the socialist or even communist left, going back to Orwell, pretending to be socialist or communist or anarchist, in order to confront them and maximize input. RNA activities were very collective in any case, so the individual contributions of leftist scholars were part of a larger mix of vantage points, right? So their leftist perspective is controllable. Everything is under control. They're not letting it get to the point where they're going to be saying outrageously critical things about the U.S. Fight against the Soviet Union, for example. That, there's no risk that something like that's going to be published. A veritable think tank with an emphasis on the military meaning of the second term. Little funny lines from Rockhill there. The OSS's R&A was chaired by two Republicans, forging an alliance between the state and the capitalist class, the university, in a military-industrial academic complex. Donovan, a wealthy Wall Street lawyer himself, like the other founders of the CIA were, the Sullivan and Cromwell crew of the Dulles brothers, for example, peppered the OSS administration with business magnates and corporate lawyers. The esprit de corps of the executive offices was nearly identical to that of the company boardrooms, and major corporations lent their executives and often their funds, be it Goldman Sachs, Standard Oil, Paramount, very relevant today. Members of the wealthiest families in the United States also worked in the administrative offices of the OSS, including the sons of Andrew Mellon and J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt, DuPont, etc. The Rockefellers were notably absent, but they had their own propaganda and intelligence agency in Latin America. Nelson Rockefeller headed the Office of Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, CIAA. It is important to note that the CIA, founded in 1947, is in many ways the mirror image of the OSS. And in fact, many of those who served in the OSS later continued to work for the CIA. For instance, the Frankfurt Scholars boss, William Langer, who was the chief of the R&A at the OSS, helped set up the Office of National Estimates at the CIA in 1950 and served as its assistant director for at least its first year. ONE is a kind of RNA inside the CIA. He was seconded in this endeavor by Yale history professor Sherman Kent, who was also a veteran of the OSS's R&A. So there was thus deep continuity, and as I discussed before, any problems with that continuity, right, any problematic elements of that continuity, right, especially during World War II, there's a lot of this broad front kind of attitude by Roosevelt, bringing in social democrats and socialists and communists, trying to bring them into the wing, into the coalition in America. And then after World War II, the conservative wing kicking those guys out, right, and being able to do more effective, directly aggressive work. What were the of course, that doesn't mean that these helpful liberals and socialists were not abandoned. In fact, quite the opposite. They're kind of given a little space of their own by the CIA, while the CIA is able to focus on things like murdering millions of people. What were the Frankfurt School intellectuals doing in the OSS? They wielded the main intelligence weapon, according to the CIA's David Phillips files. They prepared reports on Germany, from the rise of Nazism to its collapse, etc., etc. Right? So they're doing research work for the U.S. intelligence system. Marcuse, of course, started his career doing that. And then here we read that Marcuse later expressed regret that the U.S. government did not follow their advice. Oh no! If only they had listened to their advisors. In an interview in which Jürgen Habermas asked him if his recommendations for denazification had any consequence, he retorted, on the contrary, those whom he had listed first as economic war criminals were very quickly back in the decisive positions of responsibility in the German economy. Well, Marcuse, maybe you shouldn't have given so much legitimacy to the U.S. side of things. Maybe if you'd thought ahead, you would have known that the U.S. wasn't going to do these denazification policies. John H. Hertz, a German-born academic who served alongside the Frankfurt Scholars in the OSS and the State Department, who also took part in the Nuremberg trials, drew the following conclusion. Denazification began with a bang, but died with a whimper, because it opened the way toward renewed control of German public, social, and economic and cultural life by forces which only partially or temporarily had been deprived of the influence that they had exerted under the Nazi regime. And here we talk about continuation of the Nazi policies and anti-communist policies. 1956, the Communist Party of Germany was outlawed in West Germany. To return to the immediate post-war and Frankfurt School scholars' recommendations to the U.S. regarding the future of Germany, Marcuse and his associates advocated a social democratic reformist position, not so much a Marxist one. They inclined toward a democratic, in the broad sense, constitution in Germany, which was first of all to eliminate the effects of authoritarian liberal tradition at all levels of German life. And this is kind of that ultra-left deviationism that is so common in this. They have these unrealistic thoughts for how denazification should go. It was a position with which I, as a non-Marxist, could agree, a kind of Anglo-Saxon democracy, but one from which socialist measures could arise when conditions were right. which is absolutely nonsense, right? It's that liberal concept of and social democratic concept that socialism will arise from liberal capitalism. The West Germany was indeed bequeathed on the surface with a Western-style democracy, but we know that the Nazis maintained their positions of influence within the judiciary and the military and state security and things like that, whether overtly or covertly. And additionally, the OSS-CIA recruited Nazis into the fascist stay-behind armies as part of the broader strategy of tension. Horkheimer, the director of the Institute for Social Research, defended the Adenauer government, right, the very pro-Nazi government, and aligned himself with it, along with Adorno and Habermas. Unlikely some of the other Frankfurt scholars, Horkheimer maintained against the left critics that the West German government was a democracy, rebuffing in particular the students who accused it of complicity with fascism. Oh, thank you, Horkheimer. In fact, Habermas could even later assert that the Bundesrepublik was one of the 6 most liberal countries in the world. And then we talk about, we're going to have to wrap up fairly quickly, but there's even an overlap between these people, these intellectuals in Europe, and the actual Nazis who were recruited, and what I believe Heidegger is one of these ones in this overlap, although not we haven't talked about them yet. So check out this book. Check out a couple of the other books that have been recommended in the stream. Just want to thank everyone for joining. I know there's more in this book to talk about, but I think we addressed the really core, important stuff in this hour. So we're almost at the end. So thanks for joining. I'm gonna stop the stream, and hopefully we can keep this conversation going and maybe do more conversations and get more voices talking in the future. So thanks for joining, everyone, and workers of the world.